understanding ChatGPT, we're entering a new world where we have generative AI. And so I thought I might go through some of the technology that might help you understand what's going on and where we might go with this. So if we have a look here, we have a lot of terms. There are lots of words that you're going to have to deal with if you're going to talk about large language models. So AI, artificial intelligence, this is part of the AI environment. Now, originally AI referred to understanding intelligence and building artificial intelligences. Now, some people claim that we're now looking at machine learning, where in fact we make machines do clever things. So there's a slight difference there, right? One is using like our brains and trying to understand how humans understand things. And the other is, hey, we don't care how humans or animals or how intelligence works. We're interested in machines that do really clever things. So those are generally how those two terms are used. Large language models, which you'll also hear, sometimes ChatGPT will be described as a large language model. And that is focused on solving language tasks. So it's not trying to do a bunch of other complex thinking like jobs. It's just dealing with language, and it's a big model, which is where we call it a large language model. You'll also see GPT, Generative Pre-trained Transformer. Now, the Generative Pre-trained Transformer is a deep learning model that uses an understanding of the meaning of words and looks at their connections to train on what it means to build a sentence, right? What are the parts of a sentence? What does a sentence mean based on the words that are used to construct it? We also have generative adversarial neural networks. And this is the idea that we create some things by generating content and having an adversary, having someone who is criticizing what we generate. And by having those adversarial systems, we can improve the quality of our AI significantly by having it train against an AI that criticizes it. And so that makes everything go much faster. So you can see that with things like Go, where the AI became very good, not just by playing humans, but by playing other AIs, which were the adversary. Diffusion, you'll see some art assets, and we'll talk about a diffusion model later. Diffusion is an idea that when I train things, there can be a hidden representation in the middle, right? So if I give you a picture, I train to some hidden information and then get that picture out again. That hidden information, that hidden representation, I can play with and generate different images from subtly changing parts of that hidden representation. And so it kind of diffuses. That's where the diffusion diffuses out through the model. And deep learning is an idea of using multiple layers of networks to get a more complex result. So this is usually convolutional neural networks, where we take an input and we combine it to make features, and then we expand that out and we combine those to make new features. So it's a style of training in neural networks. Now, ChatGPT is a generative pre-trained transformer that is a large language model that uses deep learning to generate the next value. It's a mix of artificial intelligence and machine learning, just to try and get some of those words together. So ChatGPT is a large language model. It's trained on Reddit and Wikipedia and a significant chunk of the internet, a lot of words, to not store those. So it's not trying to store them. It's not a database. It is using that data to build a connection between words, to understand what words mean by the ways that humans use them. Right? So that's what it's doing. It's not storing the data. It is understanding relationships. And it's built on this idea of translation. It was actually, the original idea was that to translate from one language to another language, you have to understand the concepts of the language. And so to do that, you had to extract meaning out of sentences. And what we found is once we could understand the meaning of a sentence, you could also understand what the next sentence was likely to be. Or if I removed one word out of the sentence, you could replace that. So for example, the cat sat on the mat, right? So the AI will give you mat because that's the most common word to come next in that sentence. Not because it stored it, but because it understands the relationships of these words and the relationship to common usage in English, right? So it works out the most likely output given the context. How does it understand words? It uses a multi-dimensional representation of a word. So it doesn't represent male as the letter M, the letter A, the letter L, and the letter E. That's not how it represents the word. It represents the word as a 500 number vector. So you can imagine there's a scale along gender from like man to woman, and along authority from woman to queen, and from man to king. And so it's building a position for a king as being some value of maleness and some value of authority, and that it builds the relationship between kings and queens and men and women. So it's building all of these representations of words and the representation of the way in which they connect to other words, right? And how you use them in context. So the word queen might mean something different when you're talking about bees or you're talking about humans. It then takes those words and uses this complex model here to calculate the output, right? The best output is the output possibility up there. And it uses word embeddings, so those large representations, and it uses a positional encoding. Now that positional encoding is where it is in the sequence of the sentence that it's building. It feeds it through all of these attention layers. So there's a lot of structure here, right? This is all very complex, all of this. It feeds it up through all of this and eventually gets that output where it says, I'm going to pick this as randomly from a set, the most likely word to come next. Because it's slightly random, it's non-deterministic, so you won't get the same answer all the time unless it's obviously the most right answer. It can have working memory. It doesn't have a long-term memory, but it does have a working memory where you build a context up for it to generate an answer. What most people have been doing is when they use ChatGPT, they just go in there and they type an answer, and it gives them, they type a question, it gives them a bland answer. It's not very good. And it sounds a bit robotic. But if you give it context, if you say, here's the way that I write, now answer this question using my style of writing, that gives it more context. In fact, we call this prompt engineering, is where you build up the context for that vector of meaning to extract more interesting relationships. If you give it nothing, it will give you the bland output. Okay? Now, it uses every word that it writes out, it takes and puts back in and uses that in the whole context. So your context grows with every word that it puts out gets added to the input. And so you get this almost recursive nature that as it adds words, it builds up the context. That also means that when it has a long conversation, it starts to forget the beginning of the conversation because it overwrites that with the output that it's writing. And so sometimes you'll find that if you have a long conversation, it might start losing context. As I said, it's built on translation. Now, one of the interesting things is when you build the meanings of words, right? And you have a graph like this where you have cute puppy and you have different words for chien mignon, those words all cluster together, right? And what that allows you to do is instead of just doing direct sentence translation, what the language model does is it's been trained to extract the conceptual meaning out of one language, the conceptual meaning out of another language, and then just map those concepts together and say, well, how do those patterns, how do these areas overlap? If they overlap really well, then that's probably the same word, just in that other language. Right? So it's using a very interesting way of building up translation now. Rather than direct translation, it moves it into concept space and then gives you the output of that concept in a different language. Now, when you first go to it and you just ask it a question and say, hey, who is the first person to walk on the moon, right? You are giving it zero shot. You're not giving an example. You're not showing it structure. You're not telling the kind of answer. You're giving it no context. That's hard. It's also not really good at that. That's not what it's supposed to do. What it's supposed to do is you give it context and it translates that concept conceptually up or down into a different language, into a different analogy. You give it examples and it tries to extract the meaning. So, for example, I gave it the most interesting city in France is Paris. The most interesting city in Brazil is Sao Paulo. The most interesting city in Australia is Melbourne. The most interesting city in New Zealand is, and you leave that open. And it goes, Wellington. Because what it's done is it's tried to extract the meaning of why would I say that Sao Paulo and Melbourne and Paris were the most interesting cities. What do I mean by most interesting at that point? So I must be trying to find a concept. And so it tries to map that concept of if those were the right answer for those other countries, what's the right answer for New Zealand? And that has to do with cultural capitals, and they tend to be the artistic centres of those countries. So it was able to identify that that's what I was meaning by the word I was using. Right? So that's an example of multi-shot learning. The large language models, much better at that than trying to come up with facts, which are a Google thing. Right? Show it what a good answer looks like. Give examples of your own writing if you want it to write like you. If you have an assessment that you're trying to match, give it the rubric of how you're being assessed and tell it to write at an A level or a B level or a C level so it knows what your objective is, right? If you don't tell it what it needs to know, it will give you a bland answer. Okay, so as I said, prompt engineering is this idea of building context around what you're trying to produce, right? So what are these language models good? They're good at translating between levels of language. So give an example and then ask it to create a shorter version. That's changing levels of language, which is a translation job. It's good at creating short stories, right? Word after word, sequential creation. It creates really interesting and fascinating stories. They tend to meander and not have a goal. If you want a story to have a goal, what you do is you get it to write a short summary plot with 5 or 6 plot points, and then you ask it to fill out those plot points. So you ask it to do the overstructure, and then you ask it to do the sequential words. That allows it to do a much better job of building a layered output rather than a basic straight ahead writing. It can provide you insights into what an average person would answer in a word or a sentence. So if you want to know what the normal way of saying something is, you can actually ask ChatGPT and it will give you that average, which is great as a second language learner. You want to know what the normal way of saying things is. As a native speaker, knowing what the average is also allows you to step outside of average and move to doing something unique that's you. So you can also use it to help you write in more interesting ways by knowing what the boring way of writing is, and then you adding interesting variations and interesting different ways of saying things to match your personality. Right? So there are also many backends that use GPT. I spelt that wrong. As a backend, you just, what a lot of these do is they actually just add context, they add words to the AI call, right? So it calls the AI and it adds some additional information, some additional context, and or changes the amount of randomness so that you get different queries back, right? So this is all prompt engineering, and there are whole industries around buying and selling prompts. So if you had some problems while using ChatGPT, what would you do? It doesn't give good structure in writing. Part of the reason is because it's just going straight forward and writing every word as the next most logical word. So you ask it to write structure and then fill it in. It makes up sentences, right? It confidently says things that aren't true, right? And that's because it's not storing data and doing retrieval. It is creating a sentence that sounds right, but isn't actually right. So what you do is you actually say, hey, and things like Bing or with GPT with plugins, you ask it, how confident are you in each one of those sentences? Estimate the likelihood of being true and give me evidence for it. And then it will evaluate itself. And so this idea of having a cyclic way of getting it to check a second time, getting it to tell you how likely something is true, gives you a better understanding of where it is confident that what it's saying is true, or maybe it doesn't have evidence for what it's saying, but it just sounds right. Now, you do have to watch out. Some people get very hooked up on it, making a connection between like a word attorney and the word male and saying, oh, look, it's sexist because when I ask it later about the attorney, it says the attorney is definitely male. That's because that has, every time it answers you, that gets added into its context. So once it's made a strong connection between two words, that now becomes true because it's been put in the background. And so it will assume that that is actually true information, not stuff that's just in the current context, not something that could be wrong, something that is true, and now we're working from that fact, right? So that's understanding how the model works to generate words means you don't fall into some of those pitfalls and problems. So what are some of the things we can do? Well, one of the things that I like to do is I like to think about the questions that people are answering when they write and what questions are missing. So you can ask it to state the question, which question is being asked or being answered by each paragraph in a text. Right? So you give it a text, you say, well, what question is this answering? Are there other ways of answering that? Are there questions left unanswered? And that's actually a really interesting way for kids to interact with text that they've written or their friends have written, is to see what might be there that hasn't been stated. What are the missing questions? Because that can tell you the sorts of things you might want to add, is the what questions are left open. So can kids answer those sorts of questions? It's really good at analogies. So what you do is you get it to translate a conceptual space to another space. So if you're trying to understand something about finance and say demand supply curves and things, you could ask it, please explain the demand supply curves at NCA level 2 of the finance curriculum as a rugby match using rugby rules. And then see what it does. And what it will do is it will try and translate those concepts into another conceptual space, which happens not to be a language, but happens to be the structure of the sport. Right? Now that can be really useful for kids who are trying to learn something, because now instead of them having to work out this odd bit of maths or this odd bit of history or this thing in that abstract, they can use what they already know, what they're passionate about, and the AI will translate that concept into their personal framework, into something they understand, and will provide those examples for them. So this has got massive potential for helping a lot of people learn. If you have been following AI, the AutoGPT has just come around. It's about 3-4 weeks old now. It uses Python and it uses the large language model, and you give it a problem. It then asks GPT for a plan and then steps through each part of that plan executing that plan, and when it finds a problem, it will ask for a plan to solve that problem, and it goes through those steps. So it keeps making plans and solving problems and making plans and solving problems until it tries to get to an answer. This is really interesting because now it's no longer a chat between you and the system. You've given the system a goal. It's now gone away and started having that conversation itself to try and generate an answer with multiple stages, right? So if you were to ask it a complex question about multiple companies and comparing their earnings and drawing a graph or seeing how they compare, that requires multiple searches, multiple extraction of information, and then comparison and potentially some maths. That's the sort of thing that is becoming available now. So when we think of what are the limitations, it's really hard to follow because this stuff is happening so quickly, we just don't know. Some other interesting stuff we're doing, cultural simulation. This was a paper recently by Park et al. And this was in April this year. They took a simulated world and they gave the AIs a large language model to talk to each other. And so by giving them one of them the idea to have a party on Valentine's Day, the agents communicated with each other using natural language, using their large language models, and they coordinated to meet up, to organize the party, to build friends, to make dates, and to coordinate to show up at the right time. All of that sprung out of what was the right response from a language point of view to a communication from another agent, and some very simple motivations in the AIs. And in fact, it's hard to know whether we are not just very simple motivations built with language models that try to explain what we do. If we have a look at plugins, these are coming very shortly. So the large language model you can add to any task by adding plugins, and ChatGPT, GP4, is coming with these large plugins. So very soon you'll be able to use these very large systems and interact with the internet. This is actually going to be a safety problem. There is also, along with text, there's also a lot of them in the art and the audio space. Just very quickly, I was using DreamStudio.ai. Dall-E is very popular. And Nvidia have an AI playground, which they've just opened up for people to play with. Now, what I did is I actually had my daughter is quite a good artist. I think she is. But she drew that cat on the far left-hand side there. All right, so that was her drawing on her tablet of a cat. It was a quick one she did. I then used the AI to generate these next two. You can see that first one is a little bit AI'd. It's got a wee bit more gradient on some things. It's made the here look a bit more like here. And this one, you can see it's smoothed things out. It's given a much more sort of animal face. It's added some whiskers, smoothed it all out, made it look more three-dimensional. If you look at that piece of art, you can see the composition from her original drawing, but it's not her original drawing. So where in the spectrum is it an AI piece of art, and where is it my daughter's piece of art and a tool that helped her make it prettier? Right? This is a problem we're now having in schools, and it's a problem the art community is having, is where is the line? What is you? What is the tool? What is the AI? Now, you might find that if you think, well, actually, I can see how normal cats don't have big eyes like that. They don't have little dots there. That positioning of kind of half face on, that's all the original composition. So it's still hers. It's just hers with tool. What about these, which were, another prompt to make it even more rich in variation? So these top line cats are all with a prompt of being a bit freaky, right? With a slight smile. So it's still very similar composition, the same colors, the same eye color. It's now more photorealistic. It tried to make the ears more real, make some of the facial features more real. And then I asked it to be even more real, and it started creating photographs, but it's still the same color. It's still got those big ears and that looking at the camera, and some of the eyes. That the third one has the same weird blue eyes that she was doing. At what point is this not her work? Right? That is a question we're still having. These are all AI generated art. And for some of them, this character here, that would be quite a cool avatar character. Any of those weird white cats could be fun, but these are cats you could have. You could think that was a cute looking cat. These are things that AI is now producing. So as a lecturer, we developed this 3-layered model where we have it's not a cheating tool. ChatGPT, no matter what the schools say, it is a productivity tool. It makes you more productive. And so companies use it. Which means we are still working out what the fundamental skills that we need to teach kids. Right? What do you need to move forward? We decided that we'd create a 3-layer level where we'd have red for tasks where we said, don't use the AI. The AI can do this task and you won't benefit if you just get the AI to do all of this. An orange, which is use the AI, but we're still going to ask you about all the stuff you did. So use it to help you learn to do the things, but don't rely on it completely. Or green, where you just go, go for it. Use the AI as much as you can. Every time the AI solves a problem for you, just accelerate on, get more done. The end point is not a product I've defined. The end point is, how far can you get? Right? So there's a very different sort of way of assessing from, hey, can you do this, to how much can you get done in this length of time? Right? So unfortunately, that's harder to convince students to work hard. But it does mean we have to rethink a lot of curriculum and what we think of as assessment. Now, I also ask GPT-4 to give me a table, so make a table of the impact of large language models on education, focusing on productivity in the short, medium, and long term. The table should have rows of students and teachers and columns of short and medium, long term. Each entry should have 3 bullet points of the most important impacts that an AI language model could have on New Zealand secondary schools and education and NCA level 10. So that was what I put in, right? So that's the content I put in. It generated this, right, as a summary. So in the short term, students can benefit from improved. So it gave me a summary, and then it also produced the table that I asked it for, with students and teachers and 3 points in each along short term, medium term, long term impact. Right? This is what you'd want. And, improved student materials, instant feedback, increased engagement. Teachers could get streamlined grading and enhanced classroom resources and improved communication. These are actually all pretty good answers as to what you might see as the benefits of large language models. Right? So this is the sort of thing you can do with it, and it will produce this sort of output, which actually is quite good for giving you that starting point, which you might tweak and might expand, but is really good to get you going. So there's lots of good things. It's good at translating. It can give you tailored explanations. Students become evaluators rather than creators. I sometimes say that these are DJs rather than violinists. So it moves them up that level. So now they evaluate the work done by the AIs rather than having to create it from scratch. The teachers become guides who help steer you towards interesting areas to investigate rather than oracles of knowledge, because the internet and the AIs can solve those simple knowledge-based questions for you. Right? You can ask it to write in simpler words. It's extremely flexible. Right? So there are a lot of good things coming with these DJs rather than musicians. We can use it to create lesson plans. We can grade written work quite effectively. We can challenge students to get the best out of the AI. We can turn bullet points into full sentences, and we can provide the start for creative work. You never have to be terrified of a blank page. If you've got a mission, you give it the mission and it'll give you some examples. If you say, hey, give me 10 examples to write about that are fun for a 14-year-old. And it will just try and come up with some random things that 14-year-olds might want to read. Right? It gives you some starters that you can then build on. If we treat it as an AI assistant, right? So an art assistant, for example, we can create all the art assets for a story. If there's a kid who has a really rich story that they want to tell, but their artistic ability limits the beauty of that story because the words are right, but the images just are stick figures and they don't look nice. We can now draw those stick figures and get the AI to expand the stick figures to full characters. We can get it to illustrate the story and match the student's passion for what they're creating now with the ability to visualize that. Okay? So you can almost think of AI as being a photographer, right? That you're doing photography. So it's creating the world and you're doing the composition, right? So it's that, don't see it as cheating, see it as a different tool to achieve a result. It's great as a personalized tutor. So it gives you lots of, if you give it text to ingest, right? Something you want to learn, you can get it to write you quiz questions that you can then answer. It can explain the text and changing the complexity. You can ask for similar knowledge systems, right? So you say, okay, can you give me something similar to this or something that is like this but in sports, or is like this but in chemistry or in biology, using something you know, right? Have a conversation based on characters. It's personalized. You give it a scenario, give it a character to play, it will role play a character in a story. So you can ask it questions about the story and about that character and how that character might be thinking or why they might be doing things. And it will have a conversation. Right? You can write text and then ask it what you missed. Right? So if you are trying to write a summary, rather than saying, hey, ChatGPT, write the summary for me, you could ask it, this is a summary of this story. You write your summary. Have I missed anything? And it'll analyze what you've written and then give you suggestions of what you could add. Right? That's fabulous, right? Because, I didn't think I could talk about the dog and its relationship with the cat, right? I didn't think about that, but now that you've mentioned it, I can see that and I can go and write it. So it can read my text that I've written and suggest ways to improve it. Right? This is a fabulous tool for learning. We can also use it to mark, right? And this is going to be one of the interesting ethical issues for lecturers, is the algorithm is okay, right? So what you do is you give it a rubric, you give it the student's work, you ask it to grade the student work, and it will give you an output, right? So it's usually okay. It's not perfect, but it's pretty good. And you can get the mark out and an explanation with feedback to parents and ways to improve. And you can turn bullet points that you wanted to talk about into full sentences, right? So it's going to be very interesting once it gets incorporated into full marking. So why we have to think about this deeply is that we grade what is relevant, not just what we can grade, but what we want to grade. What's important, not just, did you do what you were told? More, is what you're doing the right thing to do? Right? Understand the core function of formative assessment. Why are we assessing students? How are they using their feedback to learn? Right? Go back to the meta-knowledge goals. What are we trying to teach you about knowledge? How confident you are in knowledge, how you had the resources to get there, how you use critique to evaluate what you were told. Every project now is a group project with you and an AI, and you defend your contribution to the end result because you did some of that work and the AI did some of that work, and you defend how much you contributed to that work, right? So this is the transparency and ownership of knowledge, and that's where we're having to head, because we can't find a way to know whether an AI produced some work or not. And so we have to do it with does the student understand what they claim to understand? So there's a Q&A. In this format, I will be asking people to send in emails and ask me questions. I'll add those in the description and in the areas around. This needs to be an exchange of knowledge. None of this is going to be purely one way. By the time you're watching this video, everything will have changed already. So this is just the start. And you need to think, what are your challenges? How does large language models can help that? What are the possible solutions? How do we work with students and run the ethics of this, right? Because ethically, this is going to be really complex to make sure that all of the work we're attesting, all the things we say students can do, they can actually do, and that when we are teaching and when students are learning, that we are helping them better themselves and become a functional part of society. So that was my quick presentation. Hopefully some of you will find this useful. We'll share it on various sources. And that's from me. Hopefully I'll see you in a couple of weeks' time when I'll do another video with an update on more new features of AI.